morning. Good morning. Got it. Okay, here we go. This is set up. And here we go. Okay, so oh, you can't even see my video. That's the problem. Sorry about that. Okay. We were in the introduction that the Mishnah Berurah recorded for the Siman Reish Nun Gimel, the Siman that's going to discuss the two rabbinic laws that relate to heating food up on Shabbos. One called Shehiyah, just to remind us, one was called Shehiyah, which relates to how we prepare to have food warm from Erev Shabbos going into Shabbos, and how do we relate to it if it's cooked, not cooked, partially cooked. And then the second time that we will not probably get to today, but hopefully in the weeks ahead, is Chazara, is when we return food back to a heat source on Shabbos. And there are certain restrictions that relate to that. So the other thing I just want to remind us from last week, we talked about this time called Mahal Ben Drusai, which is named after a bandit on the run, Ben Drusai, who would eat food that was minimally cooked because he didn't want people to realize the wanted sign on the communal ovens, in the spaces where the communal ovens were, that the picture on the wanted sign matched him. And by the time that it was once it was partially cooked, a third cooked, half cooked, whatever that is, minimally edible, he would take the food and run before he could get caught. So that is an important step in terms of the cooking process from a halachic perspective. So I want to go back into the introduction where it starts to, this was a little bit of a review, where it talks about the machloka between Chananya and the Rabbanan. It's very important here to understand this. This is a machloka between Chananya and the Rabbanan, and there's going to be a machloket about what were Chananya and the Rabbanan arguing about. This is going to be where the different opinions stem here, right? There's the actual machloket that they have, and then there's an argument about what case that they're arguing about, because it's not clear from the Gemara, or at least not clear from the Mishnah, I should say. The Gemara is unclear about what case it is talking about. And this is how you're going to get two schools of Psak Halacha, and there will be two very differing opinions that we will see both quoted in the Shulchan Aruch. So here we go. Everyone see where we expect about one. In my edition, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lines down into the introduction, where it says uflige, and this one is it's 9 lines down in the printed copies I make after the period. Uflige Chananya v'Rabbanan. Chananya and the Rabbanan argued. The Chananya Svirle, he holds im hatafshel kvar nizbashel kamachal Ben Drusai. If the food item is already cooked to the point of Ben Drusai, which he says here, kachatzi bishul v'yesh romin kashlish bishul. Some say it's a half cooked dish. Some say it's a third cooked, whatever that means. But bottom line is that they're arguing about what is the state of minimal, where it's minimally edible. Okay. So once it's Mahal Ben Drusai, muter lahashhosa al gabe kira. Afilu ein agrufa min hagechalim ve'ein ketuma. You can then put it over the heat source with a real fire, right over the kira. The kira was this ancient oven that they had, and there's no difference. We're going to see later on. There is no difference here between on top of the kira or betoch hakira. Okay, in this particular situation, the reason it's on top, they're talking about the case of on top of the kira, is because it sets up a case later on where something is not mutter, and it's not even mutter on top of the kira. So in order to keep the consistency, that's why it's mentioning here al gabe kira. But there really is no difference here if it's betoch kira. Okay, it's on top of this little oven, and you're allowed to do that even if the oven has not been grufa min hagachalim. You didn't rake the coals in order to. It doesn't necessarily put out the fire in its entirety, but basically. You rake the coals, it makes it very hard to then subsequently stoke the coals in order for the fire to really kind of get going, and become stronger. So you're raking the coals, you're not, and it's also not ketuma. Ketuma means hainu shemechuse hagechalim be'efer, that you cover the coals with ashes. By doing this, again, doesn't mean suddenly it's going to be cold in this oven, but it means that you've essentially made it hard for this fire to sort of, by any simple action, be rekindled, right? If you start to because if you rake the coals, maybe I said stoke before, not stoke the coals, but if you rake the coals to the side or something like that, or here in this case you cover with ashes, that is a way of sort of not putting it out altogether, the fire, but doing something where it will be very hard for it to to get to a level where the heat, the fire is, in a state where you could easily rekindle it by just soaking the coals. Okay, again, these are things that we don't have ovens like this in more recent times. I will tell you that the consensus opinion of what does it mean to if something is grufa uktuma today is that you cover the knobs. Let's say you have an adjustable warming tray. If you just sort of tape over the knob that adjusts the heat source, that is, according to most poskim, a way of fulfilling the obligation of grufa uktuma, of raking the coals and covering them with ashes, because the point here is that in the other scenario, there's a fear that you will then stoke the coals. So, but if you do something like you cover it with ashes, or you rake them at least to the side, so you've at least done something that will help you not to rekindle the fire. So I'll restate what I said. I'm going to restate something I said before just to correct it. So let's say that you're putting the fire out. Okay, not putting the fire out when you rake the coals to the side. What you're doing of the oven, what you're doing is you're making a symbolic gesture to yourself that will help you remember when the time comes that you might be tempted to stoke the coals because you want the food to cook faster. You'll see, I raked the coals, right? Okay, I'm not supposed to adjust the temperature of the fire. And so today's equivalent to that would be covering over the knobs in a way that prevents you. It'll be a reminder to you. So of course, you can untape it and then adjust, but the point is it'll serve as a reminder to you to not make a mistake and adjust the temperature, from low to medium to high, whatever it is, so that things will cook faster. And of course, by the way, that's a problem in itself to stoke the coals or to adjust the temperature. But again, there was this fear that you would sort of absentmindedly, you would kind of make these adjustments. So in order to avoid that, the rabbi said one of the things you have to do is ensure it's garuf v'kotum. But here the situation is once it's Mahal Ben Drusai, according to Hananya, so then you don't have to do garuf v'kotum. Why not? So he says here, he doesn't say here, but let me explain. Why is that okay? Because then you're not going to, because the fear of you stoking the coals is not going to happen, because you're going to look at the food. You're going to say, if I stoke the coals, it'll make it hotter, it'll overcook, it'll burn it, etc., etc. And so there's less of a fear once it's already minimally edible that I'm going to play around with the fire. The Chachamim disagree. The Chachamim sviralahu. The Chachamim say in the Gemara, in the Mishnah, the also im eina grufa uktuma. It's not allowed unless it's garuf v'kotum. Elaim ke nisbashal kol tzorko mitztamik v'rala. So you can't do this unless it's garuf v'kotum, unless it's fully cooked. If it's fully cooked and it's mistamik v'ralo, and even then after it's fully cooked, the subsequent heating of this item will cause it to shrink, and it's not actually good for it. So I'm going to give you an example of this. When I reheat, let's say I grilled chicken on Friday afternoon for Shabbos, and I want to have it on Shabbos day. I put it on the warming tray on Shabbos day to warm up in my house for lunch. That would be called mitztamik viralo. Why? Because it doesn't make it better. Sometimes when you have things that are already cooked and then you continue to cook them, that's actually good. An example of that would be a soup. When you cook a soup for longer, right? The longer it cooks, the more flavorful it gets. When you have, let's say, a grilled chicken, when I reheat it, there's a trade-off. On the one hand, I like it warm. I want to reheat it because I like it warm. I don't want to have it cold. On the other hand, it does dry it out, right? And so therefore, it's not actually, from a pure culinary perspective, it's not a good thing for the chicken. Now, it's a trade-off, and I prefer that it be warm and a little drier than cold and a little moister. That's a trade-off that we make, and so if it's mitstamek viralo, right, where the additional cooking of this item is not necessarily good for it, then it's already if it's at the point where it's fully cooked and it's not necessarily good to keep it on over the fire. Then it's fine without grufa uktuma, without in our day and age covering the knobs, so to stop us from adjusting the temperature, because no one would adjust the temperature. It's fully cooked. There's no fear in that situation. But if it's anything less than fully cooked, even partially cooked, like Mahal Ben Drusai, minimally cooked, like Mahal Ben Drusai, then you need to do garufa uktuma. You need to, again, rake the coals. You need to cover the coals with ashes. Again, do something that will prevent you from coming to stoke the coals on Shabbos, which will be a nisur of havara, but also it'll be a nisur of havara. And the reason you're doing it is because you have your food in mind. You want to cook the food and help it along. Okay, so that's the two opinions. Hananya, again, once it's past Mahal Ben Drusai, I don't need grufa ketuma. The Chachamim has to be fully cooked in order to say that there's no need for grufa ketuma. But it's important to know that both opinions would say that if something is not cooked, whether it's less than Mahal Ben Drusai, if you do grufa ketuma, you can always have the food cooking as it goes into Shabbos. Okay, we'll talk about this case, but let's say you have a completely uncooked food and it's grufa ketuma. The situation is grufa ketuma. So an example of this is that they have, I don't own this, but they have the Shabbos ovens. Let's say you had one of these and you put into the Shabbos oven prior to Shabbos, something that's completely not cooked. Then I have the Shabbos oven go on and I have it go off, so I don't have to deal with the opening the door and the temperature readjusting. Let's leave that out of this. Right? That's what the Shabbos oven, let's say an hour and a half into Shabbos, shuts off. So this should be, according to both opinions, Hananya and the Rabbanan, mutter if I put it in before Shabbos started, and I cover the knobs appropriately of my oven, and also that, and then the Shabbos oven, of course, for different reasons, shuts off, so that I don't have to deal with the issue of the temperature readjusting when I open the oven. So that's going to be permissible. And we're going to go through lots of different cases as we go through. I just want to lay out the basics here. The Rabbanan, this is their argument. Uvareish Perakira, Tanan, at the beginning of Perakira, we're taught, Kira Shehi Sikua v'chulei, a oven that you light begefes uve'etzim, with gefes is eitzim is wood, and gefes is, what was the word for it? Peat, P-E-A-T. That sound familiar? Okay, I had to look it up. Not something I was familiar with, and so it's some sort of vegetable, scraps or something like that. So maybe they use that to fuel their fire. So if that's how you fuel your fire, lo yitain achi yigrof or achi yitain at efer. You're not supposed to. It says lo yitain. It's an important word here. The Mishnah says lo yitain. You're not supposed to place it. What are we placing? We're going to have an argument in a second. Until you do grufa uktuma, right? Until you rake the coals, or you don't have to do both, or you cover the coals with ashes. The Gemara right off the bat in Parakira opens up with the question: Hi lo yitain. What this lo yitain that it says in the Mishnah, Titnan, what's it talking about? Rotzelomar lo yashe. Ela im kain garuf v'kotum. I'm not allowed to place the food into the kira, on top of the kira, unless it's garuf v'kotum, unless I've raked the coals or placed the ashes over the coals. V'aseh k'Rabbanan de Chananya, like the opinion of the Rabbanan against Chananya, right? Which would again lo yitain. Does that simply mean that you're not allowed to place it there erev Shabbos unless it's garuf v'kotum? Or does lo yitain mean, lo yitain rotzelomar lo yachazir? You're not allowed to put it back. Lo yitain, you're not allowed to put it, to place it. And that would be talking about chazara, about returning it to the fire on Shabbos. Aval shehia, but erev Shabbos, putting it on the kira prior to Shabbos starting. Muteres afilu eino garuf v'kotum. That should be allowed, even if it's not garuf v'kotum. And then in terms of Shehiyah, we'd be following the opinion of Hanania, because the point is here, the Gemara is saying, what was the argument of Hanania and the Rabbanan about? Was it about Chazara, or was it about Shehiyah? Right? And if it's about Chazara, then Shehiyah is permitted according to everybody, like Hanania's opinion. That once it's Mahal Ben Drusai, then there's no Garuf Akatum that's needed at all. And you can place the food on in your oven, as long as you do Garuf Akatum, totally fine, once it's Mahal Ben Drusai. Or is the machloket about Shehiyah, right? And maybe we follow the Rabbanan, which is a more strict opinion, that it has to be fully cooked in order to circumvent the necessity of Gerufa Uktuma. Okay, again, of raking the coals and covering the coals with ashes, or covering the coals with ashes. So, how does the Gemara answer this question? Well, it doesn't. It tries and does not, and it fails to answer the question. It does not answer the question, which leaves the door open for how to paskin on this question. If the Mishnah is talking about Shehiyah, that's a whole different set of psak, right? Then we're going to probably be more strict to follow the Rabbanan, the majority opinion, when it comes to Shehiyah, which is that it has to be fully cooked, in order to circumvent the necessity of Gerufa Uktuma. On the other hand, if we're talking about Chazara in the Mishnah, then Shehiyah is not an argument, and everybody agrees essentially on the more lenient opinion of Hanania when it comes to Shehiyah, because that wasn't where the argument was about Chazara. So it's a whole question how to paskin. So look at this. Upasku harifba Rambam v'ha'omdim b'shitasam. The Rif and the Rambam and those who stand with their opinion paskin. Lashhos tanan, that the Mishnah was talking about a case of Shehiyah, of can you do these things Erev Shabbos into Shabbos? That was the argument. And Ucharabanan de Chananya, and therefore we paskin like the Rabbanan against Chananya in the case of Shehiyah. The afilu lashos ba'inan al gabe grufa uktuma, in order to place something on top of the kira Erev Shabbos, unless it's fully cooked, it would need to be a situation where the oven has undergone grufa uktuma. V'hatosfos pasku, Tosfot rules, lahachzir tanan. No, the Mishnah was an argument about chazara, about putting it back on the fire on Shabbos. Right? As I like to think about it, we're talking about Shabbos lunch here. Right? That was the argument, not Friday night. Avalashos mutter afilu al eina grufa. Mishnizbashal kamachal ben Drusai v'chananya. But according to this approach of Tosfos, everybody would agree with Hanania that once something is Mahal Ben Drusai on Friday afternoon heading into Shabbos, I can put it on the fire, on the kira. No need for Gerufa Uktuma. Right? It's again, it all depends on which case the Mishnah was talking about. That's why it's very complicated, and we have a difference of opinion between poskim about what the Mishnah was talking about. And so this is why he says here, these are going to be the two opinions mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch that we're about to see here. Deya Echad, the first opinion, Hidas Harifa Rambam, is going to reflect the opinion of the Rif from the Rambam. And the second opinion that's going to be quoted, which is going to take a while to get to the second opinion, by the way. The first opinion is like, it goes on and on because there's so many iterations of how you function in the world of the Rabbanon with regards to Shehiyah versus the world of Hananya, for Shehiyah. So they're going to go through every circumstance. So the end of this, the Yeshomrim is Hudas Rashi v'Tosfos. Hanis Kaleel. Now you may be able to predict if you're able to predict how the Ashkenazim are going to come out on this one, because you see here a fight that's emerging between the Gedolei HaPoskim of the Sfardim, the Rif and the Rambam. On the other hand, you have Rashi and Tosfot, the Ashkenazi authorities, who are taking a second opinion. So it won't be surprising. You'll see how the Ashkenazim are going to follow the Ashkenazim. This is just a little explanation. And from now, now we're going to explain the words of the Shulchan Aruch, with God's help. That was just the introduction to prepare you for all this, some of the terminology here we're going to have. Grufa Ketubah is going to come up. probably every 2 sentences. Mahal Ben Drusai we talked about. Again, we talked about what a kira is. A kira is an oven where they would place things into it. We're going to talk about even you could also warm things up and maybe take a little longer. But on top of the oven, you could there's a place where you could just place it on top of it. And so this is our introduction. Let's begin the simon. I see some pictures coming into the picture from Steve Keller. But you're muted, Steve Keller. So he's showing us a picture there of. Here, unmute yourself.
Of 3 types of ovens, right? So,
okay, so
the big one is the kira.
The kira with the 2 places. Look on the far right of the screen. You see the place where you can put 2 pots.
Right.
So there's a little place underneath where you can put the coals and stuff like that. Right at the bottom there's a little hole. You take a look. Right, there's a hole where you can put things under, and also you can, I believe, right.
You can put it next to it. That's the 3rd possibility of cooking, right? Not in it, but
you put it next to the oven, right? But
right.
when you put this, you could put the pot into the oven, right? In theory,
right.
But you could, and then you would put it from down up on top, right? The coals go underneath,
right? So apparently, the kira is the
one on the far right.
Yeah, and then there's a kopath, which is you can only put 1 pot on top. That's
right. And then a tanur is all the way on the left.
Right. And apparently each one gets hotter than the one before.
Correct. So actually hold it there for just a second if you can, Steve. So again, the one on the right that you see there, that's going to be our kira. Okay, actually, thank you for showing these drawings. I don't have that in my edition. On the left is going to be a kofach. It's a different kind of oven, which is smaller. Again, the smaller it is, the more concentrated the heat. That's what Chazal assumes. And on the left is a tanur where it's wider on the bottom and narrower on the top. That's the description that the Chazal give. But their ovens, their tanur was like that. And therefore it got even hotter because when it's narrow at the top, the heat, of course, rises to a more narrow spot. And they understood this was going to be intense cooking, was going to be involved in that. So thank you for those pictures, Steve. Maybe, by the way, after the shear is over, if you have a moment, you can snap a picture on your phone and you send it to everybody so that we can have it, as a reference, in our that we can, if you want, you can print it out and have it next to you. But it'll be helpful to see those three different kinds of ovens. Yes, it's going to be a whole to do. We're going to have to go through different iterations of this based on whether it's a kira, a kofach, which was the one with the 1 pot on top, or a tanur. So actually, apropos to what Steve just said, let's begin now the Shulchan Aruch, or what Steve just showed us. Kira shehi asuya kekedera b'shoftin al pia kedera lamala v'yesh b'makom shvisas shtei kederos. So if you have a kira, this ancient oven that they used to have, which was like shehi asuya kedera, it was like a pot, right? In terms of the shape of, I assume in terms of like the drawing that you just showed us, Steve. The opening was the shape of a kedera, of a pot. Kedera is a pot, right? It has this pot-like shape. V'shoftin al pia kedera lamala, and you place the pots on the mouth of this kedera-like opening, of this pot-like opening, lamala, above the structure of this oven, like you saw in the picture. And there's place in a kira to have 2 of these pots on top of the structure. That's the definition of a kira, as Steve showed you in the picture. Before we even continue to the next phrase, I know we're in the middle of a sentence, take a look at Aleph in the Mishnah Berurah. He says, "V'shoftin al pia," that you place it on top. He says, "Gam betocha yesh makom lahamid hakader." You, in theory, could stick down into the oven, into the kira, through the hole that you saw on top, or maybe, by the way, I guess you could get it through the area where the coals. Is that you saw that picture? There was a place where you could put the coals at the bottom. I assume they probably put it on a smaller pot down through on top of. They could have put it really directly right on top of the coals. I don't know how they would have gotten it out, by the way, on a practical level. Of course, it's extremely hot to put your hand down into the structure. It's probably, very hot and not allowing a lot of heat out. But in theory, you could put it down into it as well. Yesh makom lahamid hakader umutar lashos b'mitztamik v'ralo. There was also a place inside the kira to put the pots inside, and you could do shahia inside it as long as it was with mitztamik v'ralo, meaning it was fully cooked, and the continuation of this cooking, because it's already cooked, the continuation of heating it of its being heated is actually not necessarily good for it. It keeps it hot, but it actually dries it out a little bit, so it's not necessarily good for the cooking process. The reason we're taught the case of it being on top of the kira is because when we get to a situation to teach us where things are not allowed, we're going to say it's not even allowed to be on top of the kira in a situation where it's mitztamik v'yafelo, like a soup, where the continuation of cooking it, even though it's fully cooked already, will be good for it, will enhance the flavor and the taste. And that's even not going to be allowed on top of the kira. Right? And so that we don't want to, so in order to teach that case, we're consistent in terms of talking about things being on top of the kira. But just so you know, you could be in the kira as well. That's what the Mishnah Berurah wants to point out here. So next line here, back in the Shulchan Aruch, or next phrase, Im huska begefes shehi psoles shel zeisim o ve'etzim. If you, underneath the oven, the fuel of this fire is the scraps of olives. That's what gefes is. It's this peat. I don't know. It's scraps of olive. Psoles shel zeisim. It's the leftovers that after you squeeze olives, probably you get the olive oil out. There's probably a lot of scraps that are left over from the olives. They probably took these. It sounds like they took these and they used them to fuel the fire. I'm not an expert at starting fires. I mean, that's what psoles shel zeisim is, though. That's, that would be, I think, the simplest explanation. Ove eitzim, or wood. Okay, that's something we would probably be more familiar with. A wood fire, you put the wood underneath, you light the fire, and you have this structure being heated. So then, if that's how you fuel the fire, osir litein aleha tafshilni ba'od yom lahashhoso aleha. And then it is prohibited, again, this is opinion number one, the Rif and the Rambam approach. It is prohibited to place a food dish, item Friday afternoon before Shabbos, lahashhosola, to literally, to be waiting there, to be placed there and to continue heating up there, unless it is fully cooked. V'hu mitstamek, the word simukim, by the way. What's simukim?
Ravens.
Excellent. Why is it that? Because it's dried out. It's the idea it lost its moisture, right? So same shorish, same idea here, right? Mitstamek means perish holech v'chaser. It gets like a grape that becomes a raisin. It becomes less. It dries out. Viralo, and it's not actually necessarily better for the food, like the way, again, I'll use soup as my classic example for this, where the more you cook a soup, even if it's ready to be eaten, the more concentrated it gets, and the theory, the more flavor it gets as a result. So here we're not dealing with that. If it's not that case, because if it's mitztamik v'yafelo, if it's good for it the longer, then you might soak the coals, because the more that it continues to be good for the food, from a culinary perspective, there's still always going to be a fear of stoking the coals to get the fire to rekindle, get a little hotter, get it to cook a little faster, etc. So as long as it's mitztamik v'ralo, after being fully cooked, then you can place it on the fire over the kira, Erev Shabbos into Shabbos. Okay, and that way you have nice, delicious, hot food Friday night. Okay, what else can you do?
This is all dependent on how you started the fire.
Yes, we will see that there is going to be the case of huska b'kasho b'gvava, which is going to be with like kash is like the stubble of the grain of grains. When it talks about that Paro was gozer on the Jewish people, that they had to get their own straw. It says that the koshesh kash retevet, kash is like the stubble. They had to get their own. It's like the junk, the leftover of grains, which apparently I believe, I'm not an expert on this. It sounds like it didn't get quite as hot, right, with kash and gvava. But we will talk about that. It's going to come up in about 7 or 8 lines. Yes, so this is the assumption with a really good heat source, which wood is the example that's being used here. Wood and the leftover, the psolos of the zeisim. So yes, there will be a differentiation. We will when we get to that, I will definitely point that out. That's going to be there'll be a more lenient approach with certain types of fuel. In our day and age, probably the assumption is that our fuel is pretty good. We could actually control things very well with a button on our oven in terms of what the temperature is. We can turn it up very hot. So huska v'kasha v'gbava is probably not as relevant in our day and age, but absolutely is a practical halacha that we will get to. Probably not today, actually. We'll probably have to stop before that time, but we will talk about this. So it's a good point, Steve. Okay, what's another situation where if I have it cooking before Shabbos, I place something on the fire, it's okay to leave it there as Shabbos starts. If something is raw and completely uncooked, then I can put it on the fire Erev Shabbos into Shabbos without doing grufa uktuma, without doing these two. And it's completely uncooked. You're like, what? That's like the opposite of the rule that you just taught me, right? So why is that allowed? And this is the case for the cholent. Ready? The kevan shehu chai, since it's raw, masiach dato meno ad lamachon. Uvechol halayla yachol lehizbasha below chitun. The other day, if you put up a cholent with meat in it, 5 minutes before Shabbos starts, no matter how high you put it, that cholent will not be ready for Friday night dinner. It's just not going to happen. If you want to have a cholent on Friday night, it has to start in the morning. And so if you have raw meat, the reality is the rabbis were not concerned that you were going to stoke the coals on Friday night because you were like Masiach Data. It's not going to be till tomorrow anyways. And it will stay in the heat source all the way until the next morning. And by then it will be cooked. And you won't want to stoke the coals at that point because doing so will dry the meat out. So when it's raw, the irony is when it's raw, then it's completely mutter. Now here it's going to be important to point out, and the Mishnah we're talking about raw meat, not raw vegetables. Raw vegetables can cook very quickly. So if you have a vegetarian cholent, this heter does not apply. And so you're making a cholent, and you want, and you put it up 5 minutes beforehand. You do not need to cover the knob of the crock pot. You can just leave it as is, no problem. If you put the cholent up in this. According to the Shulchan Aruch, which again, Ashkenazim are not going to pass them like this, so bear with me. But if you put up the cholent an hour, 2 hours before, so the meat is slightly cooked, it's not raw anymore. Then you would need to cover the knobs in order for this cholent to continue cooking, because there's a fear that maybe you'll say, "Oh, actually, let me switch this cholent to a Friday night cholent." And you'll try to hasten the cooking process, and you'll adjust the temperature. In those days, it would have been with stoking the coals. In our day, it would be with adjusting the knob all the way up high. So again, that's in the world of Shulchan Aruch. Again, once we're dealing with the world of Rashi and Tosfos, there's a little more room for leniency here. But certainly, if it's raw, you don't need to worry at all. I've definitely done this myself, by the way. I put up a cholent 5, 10, 15 minutes before. If you put it about 15 minutes before Shabbos, it's not cooking one iota. By the time that crock pot really gets hot to the point where there's any ounce of cooking that's going on in there, it's probably taking at least, I don't know, half an hour, just really get it to start to cook a little bit. So if you're putting it up in the last 20 minutes before Shabbos, you're good to go according to everyone. L'chol hadayot, without covering the knobs. Okay, now. Let's look at the Mishnah Berurah. Yeah, let's look at the Mishnah Berurah for just a couple of moments, and then we'll have to stop. By the way, I apologize. This is a very dense topic. As you can see, there's a lot of different terminology, and I spent months learning this topic when I was at Yeshiva University. I'm telling you, this is very. We learned also the original sources also. So it was like we went through everything in terms of the Gemara and the Rishonim and then you went to the Shulchan Aruch. It was not until after you finish all the original sources. So I'm trying to summarize things, pretty quickly. So what I will try as much as I can to kind of rehash certain things that I think are good terms to know and helpful concepts to know as we think about how we heat up our own food. Sifkot and beis im huska v'chulei. So we're talking if you fuel the fire, mishum dechol hani avdei gechalim v'chashin Hashem yechateh b'hem. These sources of heat you can make coal from them. Dechol hani avdei gechalim. Okay, they make coal. And therefore there's a greater fear of stoking the coals, as opposed to, as Steve mentioned, there are other heat sources that the Gemara brings up, which don't produce this, like the straw or something like that, where you have like the leftover straw. That's not going to produce a heat source that's going to kind of keep going like these, like a wood it produces charcoal. You have the stuff that's burnt off of this. That's just going to, I suppose that those things, the kasha and gavava that we're going to talk about next week, those will, I guess, more quickly be consumed fully. I don't know. I'm not an expert at all these heat sources, but that's my assumption. Gimel shehip psolas shel zaysim. It's the gefes is the psolas of zaysim, these leftovers of the olives. The yesh omrim hu adin psolas shel shumshimim. This could be the psolas of sesames. Okay, so you get the sesame seeds out, and then the rest of it you use as a heat source. The gam heim bichal gefes hanizkar Mishnah. That's part of the category of gefes that's mentioned in the Mishnah, as we'll talk about in Siman Reish and Zion when we talk about hatmana, about placing things fully engulfed in a heat source, and we'll get there. It's an important topic too that we'll have to touch on with regards to heating food up on Shabbos. Dalid o ve'etzim v'hu hadin pechamim v'gelei behema gasa. Whether it's so here's wood. Okay, v'hu hadin pechamim. Pechamim are I believe it's charcoal. If I'm not mistaken. That's the translation for charcoal. V'gelei behema gasa. Sorry, it's kind of disgusting, but it is what it is. We're talking about dung of a large animal. Okay, I guess this could be used as a heat source to heat up your delicious food. Sorry, and it seems a little odd to me to use, manure as the source of your cooking. But okay. Hey, litein aleha, where it says that you are not allowed to place this food erev Shabbos unless these certain conditions are met. So litein aleha, it's not about just even placing it. What if it's already been placed? Past tense. So what do you have to do if, let's say, you made this mistake? If you make this mistake, and now Shabbos has just started, you're supposed to take it immediately off the fire. Unless it's fully cooked, or it's fully cooked, but it's still good that it continues to cook. And then you should really pull it off the heat source. Which again would make it very complicated to heat up a soup. I'm just putting it out there. If you had a soup cooked for Shabbos, how do you keep it hot? This would actually be more complicated according to the Shulchan Aruch's approach. Just, again, unless you do grufa ketuma, that's the way you do it. But if you don't do grufa ketuma, then it will be hard. Okay. Miba ojom. This is, we're talking about to place it there before sunset Friday night, in order for it to sit there and wait there. The word shehiyah means to sort of wait or delay. The term is actually used also in the Gemara when it talks about you're not allowed to withhold payment from your worker. There's a biblical prohibition of that we actually just read in this past week's parsha of withholding wages from your worker. But what happens? That's that prohibition technically only applies if you withhold it on the first day, right? What happens if, let's say, there's some arrangement that's where it's not ad boker, as the pasuk says, but you pay them by your payment deadline is twice a month, so you're paying them not necessarily that day of their work. So then it's only a rabbinic prohibition called bal tishha, because the payment is waiting, you're holding it, it's just kind of sitting there. Same thing with the food here. The food is sitting there going into Shabbos. It's waiting on the fire, erev Shabbos into Shabbos. That's where that word comes from. So before the sun sets, you can place it there with sorach halayla for that, for the nighttime. You want to enjoy hot food Friday night. So when can you do this? It's got to be fully cooked. Since it's fully cooked, it will dry out, not for the good of this food. We're not worried you're going to stoke the coals, because Making it hotter is only going to make it worse for the food. Therefore, it's permissible to do this lichatchila if it's fully cooked. You could place it there without grufo ketuma. Mitzamek viralo, the sifkat on ches. Perush, what is mitzamek viralo? As I explained, kol davar she'adam atsev kishiyavesh v'nit kavetz mechamas rov habishul. Anything that a person would be upset that it is drying out and is withering almost because of the additional cooking that's going on here. V'chein b'yafelo, what does it mean when it says yafelo? It's something yafelo means hanusha samech mizeh. I'm happy that it's continuing because it'll taste better. The soup's going to taste better. The important term, it's stomach viralo, it's stomach v'yafelo. It's going to come up oftentimes in our discussions over the next number of weeks. Okay, but again, that's only when it's fully cooked. That's when the stomach viralo and yafelo come into play. Sifkat on tes, o shehu chai, or it's raw. V'dafka basar chai. It has to be raw meat. She actually is bashal tzorach sudas alay, because then it will not be able to cook. Even if you turn the heat all the way up, it's not going to be ready for Friday night's meal. It's not going to be ready for the sudas halayla. Aval yarak, but if we're talking about vegetables, ushari dvarim shem kali habishal, which cook much more easily than raw meat. Lo mehami mashu chai. Then being raw doesn't help. It's only raw meat. When we talk about going forward, when we talk about chaticha chaya, which will come up a number of times again as we go forward, it's talking about a raw piece of meat, not raw piece of anything. It's raw meat. That's the only heter that you have. Hainu gam kain basar. It's always talking about meat. Raw vegetables, not going to count for you here. Yud shlon is bashal. It's not cooked. Perish as shari litno samuch lashkia mamish. If it's not cooked at all, then you can put it there right next to right before shkia. A minute before shkia, you can put up your cholent. Not a problem, and it's not goru for kotum. Not a problem at all. But if you place it there a little earlier, Shabbos starts at 8, and you put it there at 5. It's not really cooked by the time nighttime comes around, but it's not raw anymore. So then you're in no man's land, as I like to call this part. You're not yet, cooked, but you're not raw. So then dikvarnis bashal ksas kodesh, since it's a little cooked before Shabbos started. Salik k'shiyaz man Shabbos, you actually have to remove it from the flame before Shabbos. Elaim kein isbashal kotzorko kodavzeh, unless it's fully cooked. Again, you could always do grufo ketuma. Right? You don't have to remove it as long as you prepare the fire, the heat source properly. If it is fully cooked, then you don't need to worry about the heat source. So you have two avenues in every scenario where it can be mutter. The heat source has been prepared properly, grufo ketuma, or you don't need grufo ketuma, and it just needs to be fully cooked. Or like the second opinion is going to say, we'll hopefully get to next week, it has to be at least cooked Mahal Ben Drusai, right? A third or a half cooked, right? Once you hit that, then you don't even need grufo ketuma, according to the second opinion of Rashi and Tosfos. One more sifkat on here. Klal Yud Aleph. He writes here. Even if it's warm, even right? Even if you just you warm the food, it's okay to leave it on the fire. And we don't say, we're not worried you're going to stoke the coals, since at the end, the etzem habishal on his bashal kol, because it really hasn't been cooked yet. So let's say it's a little hot. I think that's what he's describing here. It got a little warm, but it didn't start to cook yet. That's what I'm saying. Like you put the cholent on 30 minutes, 20 minutes before Shabbos. By the time that piece of meat in there starts to cook, I bet you it's more than 20 minutes, right? That thing is probably raw for a good amount of time. I'm not an expert on how long that is, but that window is also fine, even though it's starting to get a little hot. If it's not the dish, if it's not cooked yet at all, the piece of meat, then it's mutter to place it there before Shabbos without grufo ketuma, and you could go ahead and eat it Shabbos morning, Shabbos day when it's ready. All right, we'll pause here, and we'll continue. We're still in that first opinion. We still have this whole page is just a continuation of the first opinion. The next page is actually also a continuation of the first opinion. We're not going to get to the Yesh Omrim till like 2 pages from now. So probably not even gonna get to it next time, honestly. But we're going to go through all the different types of ovens also next time. We're going to go through what happens when it's heated up with a different heat source, as Steve Smith brought up before. We're going to talk about the kofach, the oven which has a spot for one pot on top, and we're going to talk about the tanur, the oven which was narrow on top, wide on the bottom, and what can we do with those heat sources? How do we relate to them and food erev Shabbos into Shabbos? There will be a different halacha for the kofach and then for the tanur. So we have a lot to unpack here, but don't worry, we're going to get through it all, and we'll make sure that there are also clear, practical takeaways about how we prepare our food erev Shabbos into Shabbos. I will give a little hint away, not to say you shouldn't pay attention next week, but the Ramah already points out that that our ovens, he says, our tanurim are kakira shelahem, are like their kiras. I think that is, generally speaking, how we treat things like the heat sources, we like a kira. But we're going to learn it in its entirety so that we're aware of all the opinions that are out there. Have a wonderful day, everybody.